and autonomous. And we are aware that this is not an easy task.
Now that Niger has also joined Burkina Faso, Mali and Guinea on the list of coup-related sanctions, it remains to be seen how these military governments will face the uphill battle of delivering on their promises.
Priyanka Sithi reporting. 5 days on from presidential and parliamentary elections in Zimbabwe, the opposition leader is continuing to cry foul. The main opposition leader, Nelson Chamisa, is accusing the president, Emerson Mnangagwa, of carrying out a coup. Despite the opposition's claims, Zimbabwe's constitutional court has upheld the vote, but international observers have also expressed concerns about what some have called a climate of fear. Dr. David Carroll from the Carter Center was one of the observers that oversaw the election process in Zimbabwe. He told the BBC that the poll fell short of international standards.
The assessment of the Carter Center and the other organizations, the international observers from the Southern African region, the African Union, and the EU, all of our assessments aligned, and that this was a context of a very unlevel playing field with a lot of political challenges that made it really difficult to have an open and credible and competitive election. So I think the prospects for calling this a successful election are dim.
I asked our correspondent in Harare, Shingai Nyoka, what the opposition can do now.
Well, at this stage, there doesn't seem to be much that they can do, and they have been keeping their cards close to their chest about any kind of concrete plans. What the recourse that they have locally is to approach the Constitutional Court to try to overturn these results. They did that in 2018 and failed. Even though they don't have much confidence in the court, what they're saying at the moment is that they're tallying their own results to compare them to the official tally, and then only then will they make a decision about whether to approach the courts or not. But they are confident that they've won, but I think what everybody is waiting to see now is that evidence from their own tally to back up that argument.
And has the president, Mnangagwa, responded to any of these concerns?
Yes, he spoke for the first time over the weekend since this vote had taken place, and he is digging in his heels. He maintains that he does not run the Electoral Commission and that he doesn't have any influence in the Electoral Commission and that he participated in this race like anybody else. But it must be said that the ruling ZANU-PF party hasn't stayed in power for over 40 years by rolling over, and it doesn't seem that they're willing to do that now. And he has said that he is now looking forward to his second and final term and continuing with the programs that he has. And so we've got two very different sides here. But Emerson Mnangagwa, despite this growing criticism, really doesn't seem to want to cave into any of these accusations and criticism.
And meanwhile, the people of Zimbabwe continue to suffer after decades of economic decline.
Yes, they do. And the impact of these assessments, the observer assessments, still remains to be seen. President Emerson Mnangagwa, when he came into power in 2017, had promised that he would institute political reforms that bear respect for human rights. And one of the important policies was re-engagement with the international community. And now that these elections are seen by members of the international community as falling below the democratic threshold, it's not clear how successful he will be now in that re-engagement policy of his.
Shingai Nyoka. A ceremony has been taking place in Edinburgh to mark the return of an 11-metre tall totem pole from the National Museums of Scotland back to the Nisga'a indigenous people of Canada. It's the first item of its type to be handed back by a British museum. Chief Earl Stevens from the Nisga'a people is in Scotland for the ceremony.
To me, the feelings it seems is so heavy on me because the way our storyline is with these poles, because they're spiritual. Not all families have this in their poles, but we, as one family, have this, and we call it a spiritual pole because it's alive. So to us, this is really, really heavy on me today, and really emotional.
Dr. Amy Parent has been involved with the campaign to take the pole back to Canada.
A year ago today, we faced a lot of uncertainty when we walked into that door. We had a lot of uncertainty about whether or not that the museum would agree to our repatriation claim. Our first visit, we were greeted with great respect by the museum staff, but as we began our discussions and went into our formal negotiations, it became very clear that we had a clash of worldviews and misunderstandings. And most prominently, it was around the understanding of the pole being a living being and not an object, and not something that could be owned by a museum, and something that we felt had been illegally acquired by the museum through the help of the Canadian government. And so it took some time to work through these tensions, but we're also very grateful for the incredible allyship of some of the folks I do work with in that museum. And it took about 3 months, and so it was on December 1st of 2022 that the museum notified us that they had agreed to our claim and that they would be returning the pole to us as quickly as possible.
Dr. Amy Parent, and the return of the totem pole from Scotland to Canada. That's it from the newsroom. Thanks for listening.
This is the BBC World Service, looking into the mystery surrounding an unmanned tanker found on an Indian beach.
What you're about to hear has all the trappings of a ghost story.
It's true. In 2011, an oil tanker off the coast of Oman in the Middle East was sinking in a storm. Mayday calls blasted out. A warship with helicopters attempted a dangerous rescue. When it was over, the ship was gone, given to the sea.
But then, something odd happened.
Suddenly there was this ship which was seen on the beaches of Mumbai, which was never seen before.
It had navigated an ocean, but there was no trace of a crew.
Can it really have floated through nearly 1,500 kilometres of shipping lanes, all by itself?
Mary Celeste, we're in that territory.
Its story was just beginning.
The Ghost Ship at bbcworldservice.com/documentaries or wherever you get your podcasts.
I'm Anand Jagatia, and this week on Crowd Science, we're taking a closer look at butterflies and moths.
Oh, gorgeous creatures, aren't they?
And there's one over here, look. Oh. How do these delicate creatures manage to fly so gracefully through the air, and in some cases, migrate across whole continents?
It's very spectacular. So you might see hundreds, maybe thousands, even millions of butterflies just flying through, maybe for hours.
That's coming up after the news.
BBC News with Fiona MacDonald. There's been a dramatic plunge in shares of the Chinese property developer Evergrande on its return to the stock market in Hong Kong. Their value has fallen by about 80%. The company has hundreds of billions of dollars in debt. Evergrande has admitted that it could go bust. A Taiwanese billionaire, Terry Goh, has announced he'll stand as an independent in the island's presidential election. Mr. Goh is the founder of the electronics giant TECSUN. He said he was entering the race to avert a potential war with China. Protests against the rising cost of electricity in Pakistan have prompted the government to hold further talks. Crowds have set fire to their energy bills, demanding cuts to prices. The United Nations has urged countries to act urgently to protect children from climate change. The UN has issued new guidance which says governments should switch to renewable energy sources. The Indian authorities have shut down a private school in the state of Uttar Pradesh where a teacher had urged pupils to slap a Muslim classmate. A video of her telling boys to hit the 7-year-old provoked widespread condemnation. Britain's air traffic control system has suffered what's been described as a technical problem, restricting flights in and out of the country. President Emmanuel Macron says the French ambassador to Niger is still in the West African country. He has remained despite the military, who seized power there in July, demanding him to leave. The mother of the embattled president of the Spanish Football Federation, Luis Rubiales, has begun refusing food in protest at what she called a witch hunt against her son. And an 11-metre-tall totem pole is being returned to Canada nearly a century after it was sold to a museum in Scotland. Indigenous researchers say the pole was stolen, and it's the first item of its type to be handed back by a British museum. BBC News.
Another trip to the zoo, Phil. Seems like
That's all we do on this show.
there's a bit of a pattern.
I'm Anand Jagatia, and me and my producer Phil are about to enter paradise. It's really warm, it's very humid as well, so we're going through all these kind of plastic curtains, lantern chains. Oh!
My glasses are very steamy. Wow, it's gorgeous in here. So this is an incredibly lush and hot environment. It's a big tunnel full of plants from tropical lands. There are just loads of butterflies fluttering around our heads. Hi, welcome to Crowd Science from the BBC World Service. Lately we've had a whole bunch of questions in the inbox about butterflies and moths. There's Bill from Germany who's seen them in his garden.
My question is, how do butterflies that appear to fly so chaotically actually manage to be precise in their targeting of flowers?
We also heard from Jackie in New York.
How is it that something like a moth, how can they fly so erratically and change direction so unpredictably that I was unable to catch them by slapping my hands together and killing them?
And finally, we got a message from Steve in the UK.
The question is about butterflies and how do they manage to fly. They have very large wings, small body, they're out there in wind and rain, and yet they seem to be able to find their way to a flower and find themselves to a mate and chase each other around.